Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the English Globe. I'm Adam, and as always, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Julia.
Hi there, everyone. It's so great to have you with us today. Whether you're a regular listener or tuning in for the first time, we're excited to help you on your English learning journey.
That's right, Julia. We're here to make learning English fun, easy, and practical for everyone, especially for beginners. Today's topic is one of my favorites because it's something anyone can do to improve their fluency in English.
Absolutely, Adam. Today we're talking about reading aloud. It's such a simple activity, but it can make a huge difference in your speaking skills.
Now, you might be wondering, why should I read aloud? Isn't reading silently enough? Well, the answer is that reading aloud offers so many benefits that silent reading just doesn't.
That's true. When you read aloud, you're doing more than just looking at words. You're practicing how to say them, you're hearing how they sound, and you're building confidence in your speaking abilities.
It's like having a mini speaking practice session, but you're using a book or a script to guide you. You don't have to come up with your own sentences. You just read what's in front of you.
And the best part? You can do it anytime and anywhere. You don't need a teacher, a class, or even a partner. All you need is a book or an article and your own voice.
Exactly. I still remember the first time I tried reading aloud in English. I was learning from a simple storybook, and honestly, it felt a bit awkward at first.
Oh, I know that feeling, Adam. When I started reading aloud in another language, I was so nervous that I'd get everything wrong. But the truth is, making mistakes is part of the process.
It really is. In fact, those mistakes are what help you grow. When I look back, I realize that reading aloud helped me in so many ways. My pronunciation, my confidence, and even my listening skills improved.
Same here. I used to read aloud to my younger brother. He didn't care if I stumbled over a word or two, and it helped me get used to speaking without feeling judged.
That's such a good idea. For me, my reading aloud partner was my dog. I would sit in the living room and read stories to him. He was the perfect listener. He never interrupted me.
I love that. Speaking of partners, you don't even need one to get started. You can read to yourself in front of a mirror or record your voice and listen back.
Yes, and recording yourself is so helpful. It might feel strange at first, but when you listen to your own voice, you can catch areas where you might need to improve.
And here's a fun fact for our listeners. Did you know that many actors and public speakers practice reading aloud to improve their speech? It's not just for beginners. It's a skill that even professionals use.
That's such a great point, Julia. And here's something else. In the past, reading aloud was actually more common than silent reading. People used to gather and read stories aloud to each other as a way of sharing knowledge and entertainment.
Wow, that's so interesting. So if you're reading aloud today, you're continuing a very old tradition.
Exactly. And it's a tradition that can help you become a more fluent and confident English speaker.
So for all our listeners out there, we encourage you to start reading aloud. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be long. Just pick something simple, a short story, a newspaper article, or even a recipe, and read it out loud.
And don't worry about making mistakes. Remember, every time you read aloud, you're practicing and improving.
By the way, Adam, do you remember any specific book or passage that really helped you when you were learning English?
Oh, definitely. I used to love reading aloud from children's books. They were simple, had lots of pictures, and introduced new words in an easy way. What about you, Julia?
For me, it was short poems. They were fun, rhythmic, and helped me focus on pronunciation. Plus, they were short enough that I didn't feel overwhelmed.
Those are both great ideas for beginners. Later in this episode, we'll share some specific recommendations for books and materials you can use for reading aloud.
And we'll also give you some tips to make your practice even more effective. So,
welcome back, everyone. Now that we've set the stage and introduced our topic, let's dive deeper into understanding what reading aloud really is. Julia, let's begin with the definition. When we say reading aloud, what exactly does that mean?
Great question, Adam. So, reading aloud is the act of vocalizing the text you see in front of you. When you read aloud, you don't just read the words silently in your head, instead you speak them out loud. You're engaging multiple senses in the process: your eyes, ears, and voice. This allows you to connect with the material more deeply than silent reading. In other words, you're actively speaking, not just silently processing information. It's more of a physical activity that involves speaking and hearing the words, which helps with fluency, comprehension, and pronunciation. It's not just about getting the words right in your head, but also about training your body, your mouth, and voice to produce those words correctly. This is why it's so helpful, especially for language learners.
That's a fantastic explanation, Julia. I love how you mentioned that it's an active process. Reading aloud is different from just reading with your eyes. When you read aloud, it's almost like you're performing the text, whether it's a story, an article, or even a poem. And that's where it really differs from silent reading, right?
Exactly. Silent reading, which is something we do every day without thinking about it, is more about internalizing the meaning of the text. When you read silently, you're focused entirely on understanding the message, the ideas, and the content of the text. It's a mental process where your brain works to comprehend and make sense of the information, but your voice and body aren't involved. You're not actually using your speaking skills or practicing pronunciation in any way. Silent reading is a valuable skill, but it doesn't help you improve your ability to speak the language. When you read aloud, though, you're practicing your speech, your articulation, and your pronunciation of each word. You're hearing how your voice sounds and how the words flow together in real time. It also lets you practice the rhythm and intonation of the language, which is crucial for speaking fluently.
That's such an important distinction. Silent reading focuses mostly on comprehension, while reading aloud is a more active exercise that trains your voice, your ears, and even your confidence. It's like training your muscles, but in this case, the muscle is your speaking ability. And when you read aloud, you're also building confidence in using the language. You become less afraid of making mistakes because you're speaking and learning at the same time. But it's not just about language learners. Reading aloud is something we do in many parts of our daily lives.
That's true. There are actually many situations in which we read aloud without even thinking about it. One of the most common examples is when parents or teachers read stories to children. Think about bedtime stories. Parents often read aloud to their kids to help them learn new words, improve their listening skills, and encourage a love of reading. The child hears the sounds of the words, how they're pronounced, and begins to learn the rhythm of the language. This helps them connect words with their meanings and understand the flow of sentences. It's also a fun and interactive way for children to learn, especially when the reader adds emotions or changes their voice to match the characters in the story. The child gets an experience that silent reading just can't provide.
Exactly. And it's not just for children. Many adults also read aloud, especially when they're preparing for a public speech or presentation. I know I've done it before. When I had to give a speech or present something important, I'd rehearse by reading aloud. It helps you hear how the words sound when spoken out loud, making sure your ideas come across clearly. It's also a way to practice the rhythm and pacing of your speech. When you're preparing for something like that, reading aloud is such an effective tool to build confidence and ensure that you sound natural and clear. Public speakers, politicians, and even actors do it all the time as part of their preparation. They read their speeches aloud to practice their tone, pauses, and delivery style.
That's so true. Public speakers, for example, rely on reading aloud to help them maintain a steady pace and to make sure their speech has the right emphasis at the right moments. Another example of reading aloud is in educational settings, where teachers may read aloud from textbooks or materials to help students understand the material better. It's a way to engage everyone and ensure that the content is being understood. Some students might struggle with silent reading, so hearing the words read aloud helps them absorb the information more effectively.
Absolutely. And of course, there are also situations where we read aloud in work or professional settings, like during meetings or conference calls. Many companies expect their employees to read aloud from reports, presentations, or project proposals. By practicing reading aloud, you become more comfortable with the professional language and the vocabulary that's used in your field. This can help improve both your fluency and your confidence when speaking in professional environments.
It's clear that reading aloud is not just limited to language learners. People of all ages and from all walks of life use reading aloud to improve their communication skills, whether it's to teach, to practice for a presentation, or even to entertain. Reading aloud has a wide range of benefits that go beyond just learning a new language. It's about making the most of the words in front of you, connecting them with your voice, your tone, and your understanding of the language.
Exactly. And for all of our listeners today, we encourage you to think about how you can incorporate reading aloud into your daily routine. It could be as simple as reading a short story before bed or practicing a speech in front of the mirror. The more you practice reading aloud, the more natural it will feel, and the better your fluency will become. So now, let's move forward and talk about how reading aloud can help with specific language skills, such as pronunciation and confidence. Stay with us. All right, Julia, let's start with the first big question. What exactly is reading aloud? It seems like such a simple concept, but when you think about it in the context of language learning, it really becomes powerful. So, when we talk about reading aloud, we simply mean the act of vocalizing the words that we see in text. It's different from just silently reading in your head, as it involves speaking the words out loud. Think of it like turning the written word into sound. This process engages multiple senses: your eyes, your ears, and your mouth. When we read aloud, we are actively participating in the reading experience, not just passively taking in the words in our head. This is crucial because it helps you connect the written word with how it sounds when spoken, making it much easier to remember and use. As a beginner, reading aloud gives you more exposure to the rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation of the language.
Exactly. And to elaborate, let's discuss how reading aloud differs from silent reading, because understanding this difference can really help learners see why it's so beneficial. When you read silently, your mind processes the text, but you're not physically speaking the words. Silent reading tends to be faster and more focused on comprehension, and while that's useful for understanding meaning, it doesn't always help with pronunciation or fluency. When you read silently, you might skip over words or mispronounce them in your mind, but when you read aloud, you're forced to slow down and give each word its due attention. This gives you the opportunity to fully engage with the text. It's a more active form of reading rather than a passive one. The beauty of reading aloud is that it's an excellent tool for beginners because it encourages you to focus on the sound of the words and pay more attention to how they're supposed to be pronounced, which in turn helps you sound more natural as you speak.
That's a great point, Julia. Now, let's explore when we actually use reading aloud in daily life, because it's not just something we do in a classroom setting or while studying. In fact, many people read aloud in various situations every day without even thinking about it. For instance, when parents read to children, they're not just helping them understand the story, but also teaching them how to pronounce words, recognize sounds, and hear the rhythm of the language. The more children hear the words read aloud, the more they begin to understand how language works. Even as adults, we continue to read aloud, especially when we're learning something new or trying to improve our speaking skills. For example, when you're practicing a speech, you often read aloud to prepare. This is because saying the words out loud helps you practice how they'll sound when spoken to an audience. It gives you a chance to adjust your tone, speed, and emphasis. Similarly, if you're learning a new language, reading aloud is one of the best ways to practice the sounds and structures of that language.
Right, Adam. And it's not just limited to reading stories to children or practicing for a presentation. We also read aloud to ourselves, and this is something every learner can take advantage of. For instance, When you're reading a book or a news article, you might read certain parts aloud just to help you understand the content better. For example, when I'm reading a challenging text in English, I often find it helpful to read sentences aloud to catch any words that might trip me up. This helps me recognize how the words should sound and lets me hear them in the correct rhythm and stress. It also gives me a chance to practice my pronunciation in a natural, low-pressure setting. Reading aloud like this helps reinforce the language and makes it easier for you to remember it. By practicing reading aloud daily, you're training your brain to recognize the sounds and structures of the language more effectively.
You know, Julia, reading aloud really does offer some amazing benefits, especially for language learners. First, one of the biggest advantages is that it helps you improve your pronunciation. For beginners, learning to pronounce English words correctly can be very challenging. There are so many words in English that are difficult to say, especially because English has so many irregular spelling rules and strange pronunciations. But when you read aloud, you get to practice these tricky words and reinforce the correct way to say them. Think about words like though, bought, or receipt. They all have confusing spellings but specific pronunciations that must be learned. When you read them aloud, it forces you to pay attention to the pronunciation rules and helps you get used to saying them the right way. The more you practice saying the words aloud, the easier it becomes to pronounce them correctly in conversations. It's a great way to get better at sounding natural in English, which is key for fluency.
Exactly. And the best part is that you don't have to be perfect right away. If you make mistakes while reading aloud, that's actually a good thing because it means you're learning from your errors. The key is to keep practicing. For example, if you find a word that's difficult to pronounce, spend extra time on it. You can even look up audio recordings of native speakers saying the word to help you get it just right. It's important to focus on the difficult words, especially when you first encounter them. After practicing a few times, you'll find that the word becomes easier to say and you'll start recognizing it in other contexts. In the beginning, reading aloud is a great way to work through any pronunciation challenges without the pressure of speaking in a conversation.
That's a fantastic tip, Julia. And it leads perfectly into the next benefit of reading aloud: enhancing your vocabulary. When you're reading, especially out loud, you come across new words that might be unfamiliar. By reading them aloud, you're able to hear how the words sound and say them correctly. For instance, let's say you're reading a story and you come across a word like ephemeral. When you read it out loud, you're practicing its pronunciation and also embedding it into your memory. Hearing yourself say the word out loud helps you remember it more effectively. And just like that, a new word becomes a part of your vocabulary. Over time, as you keep reading aloud, your vocabulary will expand, and you'll feel more confident using these new words in your own speech.
Right. And that's what makes reading aloud such a powerful tool. The more you read aloud, the more you're exposed to new words and expressions, and the more they become a part of your active vocabulary. For example, imagine you're reading a story about a trip to the beach, and you learn the word shoreline. As you continue reading the story aloud, the word shoreline keeps coming up, and eventually it becomes easier for you to remember and use. That's how reading aloud helps you internalize new words. It's like having a conversation with the book or text you're reading. Plus, when you're reading aloud, it's easier to understand the context in which those words are used, which helps you remember their meanings and how to use them.
As we can see, reading aloud is an amazing way to improve both your pronunciation and vocabulary. But there's also something even more important that it helps with: boosting your confidence. I know a lot of learners struggle with speaking English in front of others because they feel self-conscious or fear making mistakes. But when you read aloud by yourself, it's a safe space to practice without any pressure. You can make mistakes, and it's okay, because it's all part of the learning process. Over time, reading aloud helps you become more comfortable with the sound of your own voice and the rhythm of the language. As a result, you'll feel more confident speaking English in conversations, whether it's with friends or in a public setting.
That's so true, Adam. I can relate to that feeling of nervousness when speaking English in front of others. When I started learning English, I was really shy about speaking, even though I knew a lot of words. But reading aloud gave me the confidence I needed to start speaking more freely. It's like training your brain to get used to the sound of the language. When you read aloud, you're practicing speaking without worrying about grammar or making mistakes. And that really helps. Eventually, you'll find that you're more confident in speaking, even in real-life situations. Just keep practicing in a non-threatening environment, and you'll notice how much easier it becomes to speak naturally.
Exactly, Julia. And one of the best parts about reading aloud is how it can also improve your listening skills. You might be wondering how reading aloud can help you listen better, but think about it. When you say the words out loud, you're also listening to your own voice. That's a big deal because hearing yourself speak helps you catch mistakes or mispronunciations. It's like having an instant feedback system. If you say something wrong, you'll hear it and immediately have the chance to correct it.
That's such an important point, Adam. I recommend recording yourself while reading aloud. That way, you can listen back to your pronunciation and figure out if you're making any mistakes. Sometimes it's hard to catch your own mistakes while speaking in the moment, but when you listen to a recording, it's easier to hear what needs improvement. It's a great way to track your progress over time. You'll be surprised at how much you can improve by simply listening to your recordings and correcting yourself. It's one of the most effective ways to enhance your pronunciation and overall fluency. When you're just reading aloud without recording, it's easy to overlook certain mistakes. But once you hear your own voice, it can give you clarity on where you need to improve. Plus, this process helps with self-correction, which is an essential part of language learning.
That's exactly right, Julia. Recording yourself also allows you to track your improvement over time. When you listen to old recordings and compare them to more recent ones, you'll hear how much your pronunciation has changed, and that can be very encouraging. It shows that all that hard work you've put in, reading aloud and practicing consistently, is paying off. Over time, you'll notice that you can speak more smoothly, pronounce words more accurately, and even feel more natural when conversing in English. You're not just memorizing words, you're internalizing them and learning how to use them confidently in your speech.
Absolutely, Adam. And I also think the added benefit of reading aloud and recording yourself is that it helps you with intonation and rhythm. These two elements are often what make a language sound natural and fluid. When you read aloud, you're practicing the rise and fall of your voice, as well as how words and phrases should flow together. Native speakers often make it look easy, but when you're learning a new language, it can be tricky to get that rhythm right. By reading aloud, you're giving yourself the opportunity to practice this. Recording and listening back helps you hear if your intonation sounds natural, and you can adjust it accordingly.
You're so right about intonation, Julia. It's a subtle but crucial part of sounding fluent. Many beginners focus so much on pronunciation that they forget about the importance of rhythm and intonation, which can make a big difference in how well they're understood. But the more you practice reading aloud, the more these elements come naturally. And the more natural your intonation becomes, the easier it is to understand and communicate with others in English. Plus, it will help you sound more like a native speaker, which is always a goal for anyone learning a language.
Yes, and to add to that, reading aloud also gives you the freedom to experiment with how you express emotions and emphasis in speech. When you're speaking in English, it's not just about saying the words, it's about conveying meaning and feeling. So, reading aloud can help you practice stressing certain words, changing your tone to match different emotions, or even varying your speed to suit the situation. For instance, if you're reading a story, you might change your voice to match the excitement of the scene or slow down for a more serious moment. This type of practice is vital for developing the ability to express yourself clearly and with emotion in English, which helps you connect better with your listeners.
Exactly, Julia. Reading aloud isn't just about improving your pronunciation or vocabulary, it's about enhancing all aspects of language fluency. By reading aloud, you're actively engaging in multiple ways. You're practicing your voice, improving your comprehension, enhancing your vocabulary, and even working on how you express emotions through language. It's one of the most comprehensive and effective methods to help you develop a true fluency in English.
I completely agree, Adam, and I think that's why it's such a great tool for beginners. It helps break down the learning process into manageable, actionable steps. You're not just focusing on one skill, but you're developing all the key elements that go into becoming fluent in English: pronunciation, vocabulary, confidence, listening skills, intonation, and expression. All of these things work together, and reading aloud helps you bring them into harmony. So, for all the beginners out there, I highly encourage you to make reading aloud a part of your daily routine. It's a simple, effective, and powerful way to improve your language skills.
Well said, Julia. Reading aloud may seem simple, but it's incredibly powerful. For anyone learning English, whether you're just starting or have been practicing for a while, it's a great way to see improvement in a short amount of time. So, for all of you out there, give it a try. Find a book or an article you enjoy, read it aloud every day, and pay attention to how it helps you with pronunciation, vocabulary, and even speaking confidently. Trust us, you'll start to see the benefits almost immediately.
Exactly, Adam. And remember, don't worry about making mistakes. The key is consistency. Just keep practicing, and soon enough, you'll feel more confident and comfortable speaking English, whether you're reading aloud or having a conversation. It's all part of the learning journey, and every step you take brings you closer to fluency.
Well said, Julia. So, to everyone listening, we encourage you to start reading aloud today. Whether it's a few minutes a day or for longer sessions, it's one of the best ways to boost your fluency and confidence in English. Keep practicing, and we'll be back next time with more tips and tricks to help you on your English learning journey.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care and happy reading aloud. All right, now let's move on to some practical tips for reading aloud. These are going to be really helpful for beginners who are just starting out, or even for those who have been practicing for a while but want to improve their reading aloud skills. We know that starting something new can feel challenging, but with the right tips, you'll feel more confident and make progress faster. Let's dive right in.
Absolutely, Julia. One of the first tips we want to share is to start with short and simple texts. This is a great way to ease into reading aloud without feeling overwhelmed. For beginners, it's important to start small. You don't need to tackle long articles or complex books right away. Begin with short passages, simple sentences, or even children's stories. These texts are often written with clear, basic vocabulary, which makes them easier to read aloud. It also allows you to focus more on your pronunciation, rhythm, and fluency without struggling with difficult words.
That's a great point, Adam. Starting with short and simple texts will help build your confidence. Once you feel comfortable with shorter materials, you can gradually move on to longer texts. The key here is to make sure you don't overwhelm yourself at the beginning. A short passage might be just a few sentences long, but that's all you need to practice your speaking skills effectively. Don't worry about length for now. Focus on getting the words right and pronouncing them clearly.
Exactly, Julia. And once you're comfortable with shorter texts, try to practice slowly and clearly. When you're reading aloud, take your time. Don't rush through the words. It might seem tempting to speed up, especially if you're familiar with the content, but the goal here is clarity. By reading slowly and clearly, you give yourself the chance to focus on each word's pronunciation and the flow of the sentence. It's about quality, not speed. If you're rushing, you'll miss key details and your pronunciation might suffer. So remember, it's perfectly fine to read at a slower pace. This will help you sound more natural and make fewer mistakes.
Yes, and I think a lot of beginners make the mistake of thinking they need to speak quickly to sound fluent. But it's actually the opposite. Speaking slowly gives you time to think and pronounce each word carefully. This also makes you sound more confident. even if you're still learning the language. So, don't be afraid to slow down and really focus on the sound of your words. With time, as you become more familiar with the material, you'll naturally start to increase your speed without sacrificing clarity.
Exactly. And speaking of material, using resources like children's books, newspapers, or audiobooks can be incredibly helpful. Let's start with children's books. These books are great for beginners because they're usually written with simple language and clear sentence structures. The vocabulary is accessible, and the stories are often fun and engaging, making it easier to practice reading aloud. Many children's books also have illustrations, which can help you understand the meaning of the words as you read. Plus, they often repeat key words or phrases, which helps reinforce vocabulary and pronunciation.
That's a great point, Adam. Children's books are perfect for practicing because they're not overwhelming, but they still offer a lot of learning opportunities. Another great resource is newspapers. While newspapers might seem like they are for more advanced learners, there are simple articles that are written in a clear and direct style. You can start with short news stories, which usually don't contain too many complex words or phrases. Newspapers also introduce you to real-world vocabulary, the kind of language you'll encounter in daily life.
Exactly, Julia. And don't forget audiobooks. They're another excellent resource for beginners who are practicing reading aloud. Listening to audiobooks can help you with pronunciation and rhythm. The key here is to listen carefully and try to imitate the speaker's tone, pace, and pronunciation. Once you feel comfortable, you can pause the audiobook and repeat what you've heard. This method is especially useful for getting the correct intonation and accent. Audiobooks also offer a wide variety of topics, so you can choose ones that interest you and align with your language learning goals.
I love audiobooks for that reason. They give you the chance to hear native speakers use the language in context, and it helps you internalize the natural flow of the language. Whether you're listening to a children's story, a podcast, or an audiobook, the important thing is to use the material as a model for your own reading. Then, try to read aloud in the same way, paying attention to the pronunciation, the rhythm, and even the pauses. I think you'll find that it really helps boost your fluency.
Definitely, Julia. Now, another great tip is to set daily reading goals, even if they're small. For example, try to read aloud for just 10 minutes a day. I know it might sound like a small amount of time, but those 10 minutes will add up over time. And the key is consistency. If you make reading aloud a daily habit, you'll notice that you're improving little by little every day. Start by choosing a set time each day, maybe after breakfast or before bed, and stick to it. Setting goals like this makes reading aloud feel like a part of your daily routine, and you'll be amazed at how much progress you can make in just a few weeks.
Yes, consistency is everything. Even if you can only read for 10 minutes, that's still 10 minutes of practice you didn't have before. And once reading aloud becomes a habit, you'll probably want to keep going beyond those 10 minutes. The important thing is to start somewhere. You don't have to spend hours each day. Just a few minutes of focused practice is enough to see improvements. And the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll feel, and you'll find that your fluency improves at a faster rate than you expect.
Exactly. You don't have to make reading aloud a stressful task. Keep it simple and make it enjoyable. Pick texts that you enjoy, set a daily goal, and remember that slow and steady progress is the key to success. Over time, you'll notice how much more confident you are when speaking English, whether you're reading aloud or having a conversation with someone. And the best part is, you'll be improving without even realizing it.
Absolutely. So, to sum it up, here are the key tips for reading aloud. Start with short, simple texts. Practice slowly and clearly. Use resources like children's books, newspapers, and audiobooks. And set daily reading goals. These are simple but effective strategies that will help you boost your fluency and pronunciation over time. Just keep practicing, stay consistent, and remember that every bit of effort counts.
Great summary, Julia. I think these tips will really help everyone feel more confident about reading aloud and improve their English skills in no time. Thanks for sharing these great ideas with our listeners.
All right, Adam, it's time for one of my favorite parts of the podcast, the interactive segment. This is where we get to involve our listeners more actively, giving them an opportunity to practice their English by reading aloud along with us. We've talked about the importance of reading aloud for improving fluency, but now it's time to take action and put those tips into practice. We want you, our listeners, to not just listen to us read, but to actually read along with us and follow our example. It's a fun way to practice, and it'll help you become more comfortable with reading aloud and improve your pronunciation. So, Adam, I'm excited. Let's do this together. Ready?
I'm definitely ready, Julia. Okay, listeners, here's what we're going to do. We're going to read a short passage aloud together. We'll read slowly and clearly, and we want you to join us. If you have a book or some text handy, follow along with us. If not, don't worry about it. We're here to guide you every step of the way. The key here is to take your time, focus on how we pronounce each word, and try to mimic our pace and tone. You'll notice that we're not rushing through the passage. Instead, we're taking it slowly, emphasizing certain words and trying to sound as clear and natural as possible. So, let's get started.
All right. Here's a short passage we'll read together. It's from a children's book, so it's simple and perfect for beginners. The sentences are easy to understand and they have a nice rhythm to them. Plus, children's stories usually have a lot of repetition, which helps you practice common phrases and vocabulary. Let's go ahead and read this together. Adam, do you want to start?
Sure thing. Let's read the passage aloud slowly, step by step, so that everyone can follow along. Ready? Here it goes. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled between tall green mountains, there lived a kind young girl named Lily. She loved exploring the forest and picking wildflowers to bring home to her grandmother. Every morning, she would wake up early, greet the sun, and set off on her adventure. Lily was never afraid of the dark woods, for she knew the forest was full of wonders waiting to be discovered.
That was fun, Adam. Now, we want to help you, our listeners, focus on some important details. First, listen carefully to how we pronounce the words and pay close attention to the rhythm of the sentences. It's crucial not to rush when reading aloud. Each word should be pronounced clearly and the sentences should flow naturally. For example, when we say, once upon a time, it's important to give each word a clear sound and let the phrase flow together smoothly. This will help make you sound more fluent and confident.
Great point, Julia. Now, let's go through it slowly and break it down a bit for everyone. First, we'll read the beginning of the passage. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled between tall green mountains. Notice how the words small village and tall green mountains are paired together. These phrases have a nice rhythm when spoken aloud. Focus on the way the sounds connect. There's a smooth flow between small and village, and between tall and mountains. This smoothness is key for sounding natural in English.
Yes. And as we continue, let's focus on the next part. There lived a kind young girl named Lily. Notice how the words kind young girl come together in a smooth, connected way. We're not separating the words too much. This is something that will help your fluency. When you link words together, it sounds more natural. So try reading it with us now. There lived a kind young girl named Lily. Go ahead and repeat it aloud. Take your time.
That's it, Julia. Now let's move to the next part. She loved exploring the forest and picking wildflowers to bring home to her grandmother. This part is a bit longer, but notice how we emphasize the word loved at the beginning of the sentence. This helps us give more meaning to the action Lily is doing. Pay attention to the ing sound at the end of exploring and picking. Those ing sounds are important, so make sure to pronounce them clearly. The same goes for wildflowers. It's one word, but it has multiple syllables, so we want to make sure we pronounce it slowly and clearly.
Exactly, Adam. I love that we're breaking it down like this. And now let's continue with the next sentence. Every morning, she would wake up early, greet the sun, and set off on her adventure. Notice how we say, wake up early. It's clear and connected, but we pause just a little bit after wake up for emphasis. We're helping to create a rhythm in the sentence. It's also important to remember that reading aloud is not just about pronunciation. It's about intonation and expression too. Try adding some energy to your voice when you read Greet the Sun and Set Off on Her Adventure. This will help make your reading sound more lively and engaging.
Right. And now we're getting to the final part of the passage. Lily was never afraid of the dark woods, for she knew the forest was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Notice the word never. We put a little emphasis on that word because it's key to understanding the character of Lily. She is brave, and the word never emphasizes her courage. And when you read the words waiting to be discovered, try to sound like you're describing something exciting. This helps bring the passage to life.
Well said, Adam. Now, listeners, it's your turn to practice. We've gone through the passage together, step by step, and now we want you to read it aloud yourself. If you're following along with a book, great. But if not, just follow our reading and say the words out loud with us. You can pause after each sentence and repeat it several times if you need to. The goal here is to really focus on pronunciation, intonation, and rhythm. Practice makes perfect, so don't worry if it feels a little challenging at first. The more you practice, the easier it will become.
Absolutely, Julia. Keep practicing, take your time, and don't forget. Reading aloud is all about having fun and enjoying the process. Over time, you'll start to notice that your fluency improves, and you'll be able to read longer and more complex texts with confidence. We hope this exercise has been helpful, and we encourage you to keep reading aloud every day.
That's right, Adam. Keep practicing, and remember, every step you take brings you closer to fluency. All right, listeners, it's time for a very special segment of our podcast, the guest segment. As we've talked about, reading aloud is a powerful tool for improving fluency, and we know that hearing from others who have successfully used this method can be super helpful. Today, we're thrilled to welcome our special guest, Maria, who has an inspiring story to share. Maria has been learning English for a few years, and she has seen tremendous progress in her fluency by incorporating reading aloud into her daily routine. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you so much, Julia and Adam. I'm really excited to be here today and share my experience with your listeners. I can honestly say that reading aloud has been a game changer for me in terms of improving my English fluency. I was a little nervous at first, but once I got into the habit, I noticed a huge difference in my confidence and my speaking skills.
That's amazing to hear, Maria. We're so glad you're here to share your story. Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey? How did you first start reading aloud, and what made you decide to try it?
Great question, Adam. Well, when I first started learning English, I struggled a lot with pronunciation. I could understand most things when I read, but speaking out loud felt difficult, especially when I had to say new words. I realized that if I wanted to improve my speaking skills, I needed to practice out loud, not just silently in my head. So I decided to try reading aloud as a way to train my mouth and my ears to get used to the sounds of English.
That makes so much sense. A lot of learners tend to focus more on reading silently, but speaking and listening are just as important. What was the most challenging part of reading aloud for you, and how did you overcome that?
At first, I found it a bit hard to get the rhythm of English. You see, in my native language, we often have a different flow and rhythm in our speech. So when I read aloud, I didn't always sound natural. I also had trouble with the stress and intonation patterns, which are so important in English. But over time, I learned that slowing down and focusing on each word helped me gain better control over my pronunciation. I also recorded myself reading and listened back, which helped me recognize areas where I needed to improve.
That's a great tip. Recording yourself is such a helpful strategy because it lets you hear your progress and pinpoint any mistakes you might not notice in the moment. Can you share more about the specific steps or methods you used in your practice routine?
Definitely. One of the first things I did was pick short, simple texts to read aloud. I started with children's books because the vocabulary was easy to understand, and the sentences were simple but effective for practicing pronunciation. Over time, I moved to slightly more complex texts like short stories and news articles. I also set a goal to read aloud for about 15 to 20 minutes every day. I didn't push myself too hard, but I tried to make it a regular habit. The key for me was consistency. Just like any skill, the more you practice, the better you get.
That's fantastic advice, Maria. Starting with short texts is a great idea, especially for beginners. And I love how you mentioned consistency. It's so important to keep practicing regularly, even if it's just a little bit each day. What other tips do you have for beginners who want to start reading aloud and improve their fluency?
One tip I would give is to listen to native speakers as much as possible. Whether it's podcasts, audiobooks, or videos, hearing how the language is spoken naturally will help you mimic the correct pronunciation and intonation. After listening, try reading along with the audio. This way, you're matching your pronunciation with the speakers, which will help you improve much faster. Another tip is to read aloud with expression. It's important to read with feeling, not just as a mechanical task. This will help you sound more natural and fluid. Don't be afraid to exaggerate the intonation or emotion in the text, especially when you're practicing on your own. It makes the reading more fun and will help you develop better speaking habits.
Those are such useful tips, Maria. I love the idea of reading with expression and listening to native speakers. It really helps to make the language come alive. So, if you could go back to when you first started learning English, what advice would you give yourself about reading aloud and improving your fluency?
That's a great question, Adam. If I could go back, I would tell myself not to be afraid to make mistakes. In the beginning, I was very self-conscious when I read aloud, especially when I didn't get the pronunciation right. But over time, I learned that mistakes are part of the learning process. The more I practiced, the more comfortable I became. So I would say to beginners, don't be afraid to make mistakes and celebrate the small victories. Every time you improve, whether it's a new word or a sentence that sounds better, that's progress. Keep going and the fluency will come.
I love that, Maria. It's so important to embrace mistakes as part of the journey and not get discouraged. We all start somewhere, and as long as we keep practicing, we'll get better and better. Thank you so much for sharing your story and these incredible tips with our listeners today. I know they'll find them super helpful.
Yes, thank you, Maria. Your insights are really inspiring, and I'm sure our listeners will feel more motivated to start reading aloud and practicing regularly. You've shown us that consistency, listening to native speakers, and not being afraid to make mistakes are all key to improving fluency. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Julia and Adam. It was a pleasure to share my experience with you and your listeners. I hope everyone feels encouraged to start reading aloud and enjoy the process. Remember, it's all about taking small steps every day.
Absolutely. And we hope you, our listeners, feel ready to take on the challenge of reading aloud and improving your English fluency. Keep practicing, stay consistent, and have fun with it.
Thanks again, Maria. And to everyone listening, we'll be back with more tips and insights to help you on your English learning journey. Until next time, happy reading aloud.
Goodbye, everyone, and keep practicing.
All right, listeners, let's dive into one of the more challenging parts of learning a new language. The common challenges that many of us face when reading aloud. Whether you're just starting out or have been practicing for a while, we all encounter obstacles along the way. But the good news is that there are always ways to overcome them. Let's go through some of the most common struggles learners face and share some practical solutions.
Yes, that's right, Adam. First up, let's talk about feeling shy or nervous when reading aloud. It's a very common issue, especially for beginners. Many learners feel self-conscious about making mistakes or worrying that others will judge their pronunciation. If you're someone who feels nervous about reading aloud, you're definitely not alone. It's totally normal to feel that way. I remember when I was learning a new language, I felt embarrassed when I had to read in front of people, and I was always afraid of saying something wrong. But the key to overcoming this fear is to practice self-compassion.
Exactly, Julia. Feeling shy or nervous is something we all experience at some point. But here's the thing. The more you practice, the more comfortable you will become. One way to ease into reading aloud is to start in a private space where no one else is around to judge. You can read aloud in the comfort of your own home or even when you're walking alone. That way, you'll begin to build your confidence without the pressure of others listening. Also, keep in mind that making mistakes is an important part of the learning process. When you make a mistake, it's just an opportunity to learn. No one expects you to be perfect, especially in the beginning.
I couldn't agree more, Adam. And another tip that helped me overcome shyness was to visualize success. Before reading aloud, I would picture myself speaking clearly and confidently. I know it sounds a bit silly, but it really does work. The more you imagine yourself being confident, the more it starts to feel natural when you actually speak. Also, if you are reading aloud with others, try to create a supportive environment. If you're in a language group or practicing with a friend, make sure to give each other positive feedback and encouragement. Remember, we're all on this learning journey together.
Great advice, Julia. So, for our listeners, if shyness or nervousness is holding you back, try starting with a quiet place, practicing on your own, and slowly building up confidence. Also, give yourself plenty of grace and remind yourself that mistakes are part of the journey. Now let's move on to another common challenge that many people face when reading aloud, struggling with difficult words.
Yes, this is a big one. It's normal to come across words that are hard to pronounce, especially when you're learning a new language. English has so many rules and exceptions, which can make it tricky to know how to say certain words. For example, words like though, kernel, or acquaintance can really trip people up. If you find yourself struggling with a difficult word, don't panic. The best thing you can do is break the word down into smaller parts. Start by pronouncing each syllable slowly, and then gradually speed up until it starts to sound more natural. You can also use online resources like pronunciation guides or apps that help with phonetic spelling to help you get it right.
That's such a great point, Julia. Another effective technique is to listen to native speakers pronounce the word. You can find videos, audiobooks, or even podcasts where the word is said in context. Listening and mimicking how native speakers say difficult words can help you understand the correct pronunciation. You can also try reading the word aloud several times. It might feel awkward at first, but with repetition, it will get easier. If you're not sure how to say a word, try looking up a pronunciation video or asking a friend who speaks English fluently. Most people are happy to help you.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to take your time with words that feel difficult. There's no rush to get it perfect right away. A good strategy is to practice frequently. For example, when you come across a difficult word, add it to your list of words to master. Every time you read aloud, include that word and focus on saying it correctly. Over time, with consistent practice, those difficult words will become much easier to pronounce.
I love that idea. Consistent practice is key. Now, let's talk about one more common challenge that many learners face when reading aloud: losing focus. Sometimes when we're reading aloud, we get distracted and our attention starts to wander. This can make the reading sound less fluid and can even interrupt the flow of our practice. It's easy to lose focus, especially if you're tired, or the text is long or difficult. If this is happening to you, you're not alone. So how can we overcome this challenge?
It happens to all of us, Adam. When you find yourself losing focus, one great strategy is to break your reading into smaller chunks. Instead of reading for long periods, focus on reading for just a few minutes at a time. For example, you can set a timer for 5 or 10 minutes and just focus on reading aloud during that time. Once the timer goes off, take a short break, and then go back to it again. This helps keep your mind fresh and prevents you from feeling overwhelmed. Also, when you feel your focus drifting, try to take a deep breath and refocus your mind on the words in front of you. Sometimes, just pausing for a second can help you reset and stay on track.
Yes, and I would also recommend using visual cues to help maintain focus. For instance, try highlighting or underlining important parts of the text so you have something visual to guide you. If you're reading a book or article, you can also use a finger or a pen to follow the words as you read. This helps keep your eyes engaged and prevents your mind from wandering. And one more trick is to vary your reading pace. When you read aloud, try speeding up or slowing down in certain sections. This keeps things interesting and can help you stay engaged with the material.
Those are fantastic suggestions, Adam. Breaking the reading into manageable sections, using visual cues, and varying the pace can all help keep your focus sharp. If you feel your attention slipping, just take a step back, reset, and try again. It's all part of the process. So, for our listeners out there who struggle with focus, try incorporating these strategies into your practice routine.
Exactly. So, let's recap what we've covered today. First, if you feel shy or nervous about reading aloud, try practicing in a private, comfortable space, and remember that making mistakes is part of learning. Second, if you're struggling with difficult words, break them down into smaller parts and practice listening to native speakers. Finally, if you're losing focus, use smaller reading sessions, visual cues, and vary your pace to stay engaged.
These tips will definitely help you overcome some of the most common challenges when it comes to reading aloud. Just remember, the more you practice, the easier these challenges will become to manage. Keep working at it, and don't get discouraged. With time and patience, you'll see huge improvements in your fluency.
Well said, Julia. And for all our listeners, keep pushing through those challenges. Reading aloud will become easier and more natural the more you do it. We're confident that you can do it. Stay patient and keep practicing. As we come to the end of today's podcast, we want to take a moment to give you a little extra encouragement. It's easy to feel like progress is slow when you're learning a new language, but let us remind you, fluency is a journey, not a destination. Every step you take is a step closer to your goal, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Many learners, even those who speak fluently today, started with the same fears and challenges you might be facing right now.
Absolutely, Adam. We all start somewhere, and I want to share a story of a learner named Anna. Anna was very shy about reading aloud. She felt nervous and often avoided speaking in English. But after hearing about the benefits of reading aloud, she decided to give it a try. Anna started with just a few minutes a day, reading simple books to herself, and soon she found that her pronunciation was improving, and she felt more confident when speaking in English. Little by little, she built the habit, and now Anna reads aloud every day, and she's not afraid to speak English in public anymore.
That's such an inspiring story, Julia. Anna's experience shows that even small, consistent efforts make a big difference. If you can commit to just 10 minutes a day of reading aloud, you'll gradually see improvement, and before you know it, you'll be reading longer texts with more confidence. Another example is Carlos, a learner from Spain who struggled with vocabulary. He felt stuck in the middle of his learning journey, but after he started reading aloud daily, he noticed that many new words became familiar to him. The repetition and practice helped him remember them better, and he began using them confidently in conversation.
Exactly, Adam. Carlos is another great example of how reading aloud can accelerate your learning. It's not just about improving your pronunciation, it also boosts your vocabulary and listening skills. All of this adds up to greater fluency. And remember, the road to fluency isn't a straight line, it's full of ups and downs. There may be times when you feel frustrated, but those moments are part of the process. Each time you practice, you're improving, even if it doesn't feel like it. It's important to celebrate the small victories along the way.
That's so true, Julia. And to our listeners, we want to remind you that fluency doesn't happen overnight, but every little effort counts. So keep practicing, Stay positive, and don't compare your progress to others. Your journey is unique, and you are doing great. It's the consistency that matters most. Keep going, and soon enough, you'll look back and see how far you've come. So take a deep breath, believe in yourself, and remember that you're not alone on this journey.
Now, as we come to the end of today's episode, let's do a quick recap of the key points we covered. Today, we talked about how reading aloud can greatly improve your fluency by enhancing your pronunciation, boosting your vocabulary, increasing your confidence, and helping you become more aware of your listening skills. We also discussed some practical tips for reading aloud, like starting with simple texts, practicing at your own pace, and using resources like children's books and audiobooks. And, of course, we covered some common challenges, like feeling nervous or struggling with difficult words, and how you can overcome those obstacles with consistency and practice.
Exactly. And we hope that, after listening to today's episode, you feel more motivated to start reading aloud as part of your English learning routine. Remember, it's all about consistency, patience, and making small, steady progress. So, don't wait. Start today by reading aloud for just 10 minutes and try to make it a daily habit. Over time, you'll see incredible improvement.
And speaking of starting today, I encourage you to choose a short passage or even a children's book and practice reading aloud after this podcast. It's a simple and fun way to begin. If you're unsure of what to read, there are plenty of free resources available online. Don't hesitate to use them.
Before we end, let's take a quick look at what's coming up in our next episode. In our next episode, we'll be discussing how to overcome common speaking barriers, a topic that many of you have asked about. We'll talk about how to get past the fear of speaking and how to use strategies to sound more confident in conversations.
That's right. We'll dive deep into how to tackle language barriers, overcome anxiety, and find your voice in English conversations. So make sure you tune in. We're excited to share more tips and strategies with you.
Before we wrap up, we just want to say thank you to all our listeners for joining us today. We hope you found this episode helpful and encouraging. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to reach out with your feedback or share your reading aloud experiences with us. We're always happy to hear from you.
Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day and happy reading aloud.